So, I wanted to give you an example of how you might read an article to notice the potential American issues or problems that are being referenced either explicitly or implicitly in that article, how to farm it for keywords and potential sources that you might use for writing your letter, and how to think about how to use what's already there in the letter to help you come up with ideas for what are the potential solutions you might offer, and who is the audience you might write your letter to? So I started with this really, I thought, rich article about um, expunging people's criminal records in order to help them better themselves and deal with some of these American issues and problems that come up. So right away, when I read this article, it takes me about 7 minutes to read it or listen to the podcast of it. And already I have noticed that there are a bunch of American issues that are either explicitly brought up or I can imply are part of what they're talking about. So the first concept that comes up that I know is an American issue and problem, they cite explicitly, which is mass incarceration. They talk about bipartisan concerns related to mass incarceration. Um, Another thing that comes up in the article is the issue of unemployment because people are having difficulty getting jobs because of their criminal records. They also are having difficulty finding housing. Um, I could imply that because of these problems, poverty is another issue that's being talked about in this article. It also mentions explicitly issues of racial injustice because it talks about the people who are most affected by this problem are tend to be people of color. It brings up, and I have a little typo here, the idea of criminal justice reform, that is a bipartisan concern in America right now. It also brings up explicitly the issue of taxes when it talks about the cost of some of these problems. So that is another issue, is that there's a potential for cutting taxes or using our taxes more wisely in this article. So as I'm reading it, I'm also thinking about potential keywords and sources that I can glean from this article. They've already done a bunch of work for me, and I can just sort of follow the trail of breadcrumbs that they've left me. So some of the words that stood out to me as potential keywords I might want to use when I go to the library website are the terms expungement, clemency, and restoration of rights. Those all seemed like rich potential keywords for me to use when searching for other sources. But then also, this article gives me actual links to the sources they used. So when I see a hyperlink attached to a comment like one study estimates, I know that if I follow that trail, it will take me to probably the original source or study where they got that information. And I may want to use those for my own sources when I'm doing my annotated bibliography and potentially when I'm writing my letter. But this is going to give me some good background, and I'll show you that in a minute. I also notice when I'm reading it that the article explicitly mentions some barriers that come up in for people in this situation, and for solving the problem as a whole. And those barriers, I look at those because those can give me a clue about potential solutions that I might want to offer to the recipient of my letter. When I'm asking them to take an action, I may be asking them to take an action that specifically addresses one of these barriers that are brought up in the article. So one of the things it talks about is one of the problems is that there's just a patchwork of laws across the country, that they're not consistent, systemic, and they don't rely on best practices. Everybody's sort of reinventing the wheel. So that's one thing I could think about. Also, prosecutors aren't necessarily cooperating. It talks about prosecutorial foot dragging. So that gives me some ideas. And maybe I want to think about what I could do to solve that problem. Also, another barrier it mentions is that the filing fees are expensive, and people in this situation often can't afford the filing fees. And then also, people don't know about it or know how to access the resources to have their records expunged. So that could give me an idea about, well, maybe I want to propose something about how we need to get the word out to people and advertise to people that this is a possibility for them. So also the article mentions some actual actions and solutions that have already been taken. So it mentions that ballot measures are one way to address the issue, and specifically they talk about Proposition 47 in California. So I'm probably going to want to look that up, find out more about how that happened and what it says. It talks about how advocacy is being done through nonprofits, and it mentions a specific nonprofit that's doing this work. So I probably want to find out more about that nonprofit and see what they have to say about it. They talk about state legislation, including the proposed legislation from Democrats in California to automate expungement. So I might want to look into that and see what are they proposing, and is that something that I could maybe talk to my own state legislator about doing. At the end of the article, it refers back to this this legal expert who mentions that she thinks that the solution would be to have fewer minor cases being taken to court by prosecutors. So that might be something I want to tell my recipient that we should do in order to help solve this problem. Also, because of that barrier of the filing fees, I thought, well, maybe reducing or waiving filing fees would be a way to help people get through this process more easily. Oops, I made a typo here. So these should actually be under stakeholders. So the stakeholders, I also noticed that all the people who are affected by this issue, so they talk about taxpayers and employers, obviously people with criminal records. They mention that public defenders are involved, prosecutors are involved, legislators are working on this, voters are voting on it on ballot measures. There are criminal justice nonprofits who are working on it, and specifically they talk about how Indiana and California have taken some strides on this issue. So knowing about the stakeholders also gives me some ideas about whom I might write my letter to. But then even more importantly, I noticed that this article talks about the actual agents of change, the people who are actually doing something to try to address this problem. So they talk about the nonprofits who are assisting people and doing advocacy related to this issue. So that tells me maybe I want to write my letter to a nonprofit, and I want to give them some ideas about what they could do to address this issue. Prosecutors are also, like I mentioned before, that legal expert said, well, one of the issues that would help is if prosecutors would stop pursuing these minor cases, and so fewer people would have criminal records. So perhaps I want to write to the county attorney in my county. State legislators are coming up with legislation. Maybe I want to write to my state legislator about coming up with a law to deal with this issue. Of course, first I'd want to find out if we do have a law on the books currently. Voters also, they're voting on propositions and ballot measures. So I might want to find out if there is some kind of venue where I could write a letter to voters. And I might want to see if there's any upcoming legislation or ballot measures coming up about this issue. And then, of course, public defenders were also mentioned. Part of the issue is that people with records are relying on public defenders to let them know about the resources available. So I might decide that I want to write to the public defender's office to encourage them to do a better job of letting people know that these resources exist. So anyway, that is just to let you know how to read an article, to glean what are the American issues and problems, what are the potential solutions, either explicitly being taken already or implicit in when I think about what the barriers are, and how do I leverage the sources of my article. So back to the article, just to show you how here's that American University law professor who has written extensively. I click on that hyperlink and suddenly I have this awesome um, paper that she wrote. And not only that, but it's got some great keywords that I might use in my search. It's even got the citation for me when I'm ready to do my annotated bibliography. I've already got a citation. So anyway, use these resources here that are available to you. It's really easy to click through these hyperlinks to go to these sources and use them yourself as sources. Maybe they'll give you more ideas about potential audiences. So this is the Collateral Consequences Resources Center website. They probably have all kinds of good ideas that I can use.